I think we are good to get started. So welcome everyone, very glad you could join us. I hope everyone is as excited as I am to hear Kim speaking. Before I turn the mic over, I just have a little bit of introduction to go through. First, thank you for joining us on behalf of the Oak Ridges Marine Land Trust. I will get us started with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge at the Land Trust that Indigenous peoples have had and continue to have a presence and deep connection with the lands on and near the Oak Ridges Moraine, a part of what is known to the Indigenous peoples of North America as Turtle Island. These lands are the meeting place of two treaties, the lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit and those of the Chippewas of Georgina Island, Rama, and Beausoleil, and of the Mississaugas of Alderville, Curve Lake, Hiawatha, and Scugog Island, the First Nations of the Williams Treaties. We would like to thank them and other Indigenous peoples for sharing this land with us. We acknowledge that Indigenous people have been subjected to colonial oppression and injustice which continues to this day. We acknowledge that the first step to reconciliation is recognizing Indigenous rights, Indigenous people, and their inherent rights to the land. We will continue to create a better future for our relationship with Indigenous peoples and the land. The Oak Ridges Marine Land Trust endeavors to honor the land and its treaties by ensuring healthy ecosystems that thrive forever. We recognize that working today with Indigenous peoples to include ecological traditional knowledge systems moves us towards an equitable and sustainable future. That is a really big theme for us, and we hope that when you go out on the land to apply the knowledge that you gained today, that you keep in mind the whole history of the land that we're walking on. At the Land Trust, we are working very hard towards that equitable, sustainable future. We have a few different tools in our toolkit. We're working in an area where the vast majority of land is privately owned, 90% of the moraine. As you may have seen in the introductory video, it's that 160-kilometer wide stretch of land from Trent River to the Niagara Escarpment. So we work with private landowners to protect ecosystems and habitat so future generations can continue to enjoy the land that we are on today. And without any further ado, I'm going to do a quick introduction for Kim and then turn it over to her. Kim is here to talk to us about animal tracking today, but also has a lot of expertise in search and rescue. She is the author of the original online field guide to tracks and tracking dating back to 1997, so almost 30-year anniversary. Kim is certified as a track and sign specialist, Trailing 2, Tracker 2 through Cyber Tracker, and the creator of the Animals Don't Cover Their Tracks Facebook group. So Kim, please take it away.
All right, thank you. So today I'm going to talk about the type of tracks and signs that you can find in your backyard. And hopefully this will be fun and entertaining, and you'll learn a little bit about the wildlife that are commonly seen in backyards. So Cyber Tracker is the organization that certifies wildlife trackers, and it began in South Africa with certifying trackers to be able to lead tourists in to find the big five wildlife species. And from there, it has spread worldwide to certifying trackers in the skill of wildlife track and sign identification, and in trailing, which is following the animals to catch up to the animal and be able to see it without it seeing you. So this is something I've been participating in for quite a number of years. And if you do want to learn more about tracks, I would recommend the Cyber Tracker process, or I will give you some resources at the end of this slideshow. All right, cool. So I wanted to talk about species that are likely to show up in backyards. And deer, of course, show up pretty much everywhere. But they do like backyards because we often grow plants in our gardens. And deer tracks are really fun. They're just really neat to find. They have this heart shape to them. So if you look at a deer track and you want to know which direction it is traveling, look for that heart shape. So this is going to be upside down, but I'll draw the little heart in here so you can see on the, oops, something's going on with the pen there. Anyway, that's the little heart shape. The direction of travel is that way. And so this animal is heading towards the top of your screen there. And deer tracks are composed of two hooves, each half of the hoof, and deer are walking on toes number 3 and 4, which to us would be our the middle fingers, middle two fingers in our hand. So they do have dew claws, which are the other two toes, and those only show up in deep substrates usually. Oh, and in when they're running, those dew claws will show up. So look for those two little points to show up behind the track. Now, there is some discussion among hunting communities that that's something that indicates a buck track versus a doe, but that's not really the case. So if you're going to look for buck versus doe, there are things to look for. And mainly it has to do with the front track being larger than the hind track. So deer are going to be your most common, probably backyard species, and they're quite fun to find. Let's see, why is that not advancing? There we go. Okay, so deer tracks, when they're running, they look like the ones down below here on the lower right. And these tracks show the dew claws, and you can tell the front from the hind dew claw on a deer track by looking at which direction those dew claws are pointing. So on the hind track, the dew claws are arranged so that they point forward. And on the front track, the dew claws point out towards the side. So they're pointing more this direction and this direction. Those dew claws being these two little smaller tracks. Sorry about that odd looking arrow there, but those are that's one way to tell the front from the hind tracks on a deer if you have the running tracks. Now, white-tailed deer have antlers that come out from a single tine. So one of the tines will come out, and then the branches will come out from that. Mule deer, those tines will branch, so they'll fork into two, so they look different. So this is a white-tailed deer antler right here. And deer scats, if you find them, they're usually very small compressed pellets, and they look like they're made out of sawdust. So it's because of their diet varies during different times of the year. So in the winter, they might not have as many green leaves to feed upon. And so they're eating more browse, which would be the woody material. And so their scats are going to be a little bit drier. In the springtime, they have more greenery to feed on, and their scats can be more liquid and they might stick together. But they're usually composed of pellets. And even when they do stick together, you'll find that pelletized form is pretty easy to recognize in their scats. So this is another one of the very common species that you may find. And this is the raccoon, of course, cute little guy there. They have tracks that look very similar to our own hands and feet because they have 5 long toes, and those long toes look kind of cigar shaped, and they point forward usually, but often they splay out to the sides. Their toes are very flexible. Raccoons are able to open things like latches, and they can get into coolers, and if you have ever had them get into your garbage cans, raccoons can get into a lot of things with those nice long fingers. And it also allows them to climb and grasp, and they will sometimes dunk their food in water to enhance their sense of touch. And so they have the name Procyon lotor, which means washer bear, and that's because they are known for getting their food wet. So when you find a raccoon track, the front track tends to show a little bit more of the splay in the toes. So the toes will be pointing outwards, and the hind track will show more of a heel than the front track will. So you can get this longer heel showing up on the hind track, but that doesn't always show up. So that's not a really predictable thing to look for, but look for the toes arranged a little bit more forward pointing on the hind track of a raccoon like this. They point more forward rather than slightly to the side over here on this front track. So the little handprints, and when they walk, they have a unique way of walking. So raccoons walk by placing, or well, when you find their trail, it looks like this pattern up here in the upper right-hand corner, where you have a hind track next to a front track. So I'm going to label these. So this is the hind, this is the front up here, and then on this side, they switch. So it's a front here and a hind over here. So when they're walking, it's called extreme overstep walk, where those feet land side by side and just continuously alternate in that pattern as the raccoon is moving. So that's a rather unique gait to the raccoon. And if you find tracks in the snow that are unclear, a lot of times you can look at the pattern and it will help you identify raccoon tracks. Raccoons get into a lot of things, and you do commonly find them in backyards. They get into barbecues, they get into garbage cans, um, they walk around on decks, etc. And so it's very common to find their tracks on surfaces that are found in our backyards. So on the left there, this is on a deck, got into some greasy food in a trash can and walked around and left little raccoon tracks. And then in the middle, you can see that pattern that I was talking about, where the tracks are side by side, and that pattern continues as the trail lengthens. So just look for that. That will help you identify the raccoon tracks, as well as those long fingery toes and the pad that they're usually connected to. We also have opossums, and this is sometimes called the possum, but it's actually not a possum because the opossum is a marsupial that lives in the North American continent, whereas a possum is an Australian mammal. So the opossum is the only North American marsupial, which means that they're a non-placental mammal. Their babies are born when they're super small. 14 of them would fit into a teaspoon. And all 14 babies make their way up to the mom's pouch, which is on her belly. And there they attach to a teat inside the pouch. And they'll spend the rest of their growth period, their gestation, growing in there until they're large enough to come out. And then they'll ride along on her back and hang out with her. But those little baby opossums are super small. And because they don't have a placenta and those babies don't continue to grow internally like other mammalian babies do, they actually go out into the pouch, and the pouch serves as sort of an external womb for them to grow in. So opossums are also unique in that they have an opposable thumb. And you can see that in these tracks, and in the illustration down here, you can see the thumb. So on the hind foot, that opposable thumb is like our own. It allows them to grip things, allows them to grab branches, to grasp nesting material and gather it, all kinds of things. So when you find their tracks, a lot of times trackers describe these as a hot mess of toes, or it looks like a tarantula fell from the sky and landed on the ground, and all these toes are splattered everywhere. Because that's what it looks like. The way they walk, their hind foot ends up not quite obscuring the front foot, but that's the hind foot right there with its um, opposable thumb sticking out to the side. So that's the left hind foot because that's the left thumb right there. And that thumb does not have a claw, but the other toes do have claws. So those three middle toes and that one does have a claw there on the hind track. Now here's the front track, which looks like if you were a kid and you were going to draw an imaginary sunset coming over the horizon, you would, draw your horizon line, and then you'd have the sun rays coming out and the little sun. So that's what the the front track of an opossum looks like. If you were to see these tracks in really perfect substrate, or on a track plate, which is a way of surveying for animals, you would find that they have fingerprint whorls on their fingers. And just like humans, they have the little fingerprint ridges on their fingers. And so it's pretty cool to see those. So look for a lot of toes. Look for the front track to look very much like that of a raccoon, but the toes splay out quite a bit more than the raccoons do. They're almost straight out to the sides, those outer two toes. And then the other toes are widely splayed and look just like a little sunrise. So there's your front track. Oops, my drawing didn't come out very well there, but that's the front track of the opossum. Um, Opossums will use their tails to gather nest material and carry it with them. And they are also known for hanging from their tails, but that's not the usual thing. Mostly it's used to help them in climbing and with grasping things. So that tail is prehensile. They can curl it. But opossums are a fairly unique mammal on this continent, and it's really fun to find their tracks. Black bears, not really a common a common backyard visitor, but they can and do visit backyards when they want to, especially if there's anything that will attract them, like garbage or pet foods. Black bears are known for entering urban areas to get into things like that. They have really fun tracks because their tracks are very much like those of a human. If you saw this, you might think it was a barefoot human. Um, they have five toes on both their front and hind tracks. The front track has longer claws than the hind. So if you look at this front track here, you can see that these claw marks are quite a ways away from the toes. There's a lot of distance between those toes. Ah, sorry, drawings aren't coming out good. And as opposed to this hind track where the toes or excuse me, the claw marks are a little bit closer to the toes. So you can imagine that they use their front feet mostly for digging, for ripping into logs. And so you can imagine why they need the longer claws on their front feet, because those are the ones that do most of the work. Bears climb readily, and those front claws enable them to get a grip on trees. And I'll show you some climbing sign in a moment here. Um, so over here on the left, you have a really cool set of mom bear tracks right here. This is the larger one. That's mom bear's palm pad, and then here are her toes up here. Um, Not very good outline, but just for grins, this gives you an idea. There's mom bear's track, and she's got a pretty good sized foot, but inside mom bear's track, here's the cub's track. Little tiny, little bitty track here from the cub. And so this is a pair of cubs. There's the other cub right here. And this other cub has a much larger track than its sibling. So that could be based on nutrition. They're the same age. Could be nutrition, could be one's a male, one's a female. We don't know, but there are often differences in the sizes of the cubs when females have cubs. One thing that's kind of cool about the hind tracks of bear is that they have this little triangular shaped space that does not have a pad on it. So you can see it on this track over here, the little triangular shaped space that's just um, fur. It's not a pad. And that's different. Grizzly bears will have this or not. It just depends upon the individual animal. But on black bears, they usually have that little triangular shaped space on their hind track. So these are pretty much all hind tracks. And the hind tracks I find show a lot of definition on the heel when in certain substrates. Sometimes you'll find a hind track that does not show the heel, and it kind of cuts off right here. This heel doesn't show up, and it can be easily confused with a front track. But look for the length of those claws to help you tell whether that's a front or a hind track. So bears are known for marking on trees. They do this for several reasons. The two on the left there were because the bear was climbing. When they climb, they use their front feet to grip the tree. So when you see the scratch marks, they'll be at like a 45-degree angle on the tree. And the hind feet provide the propulsion up the tree. So the hind feet are pushing in parallel to the trunk of the tree as they push off to get the bear to climb upwards to give him propulsion. So you can tell the front from the hinds pretty much by the angle of those claw marks. So noticing that these are at an angle to the tree, that would be the front feet. And then if it's straight up and down like this one or like these are the hind feet marks when it climbed the tree. They are also known for marking on trees for purposes of communications with other members of their species. And so bears will come up to a tree and they'll rub their backs on it and get a good scratch. And then they'll turn their head around and bite over their shoulder into the bark of the tree. And that will often leave marks that are parallel to the ground on the tree. And then they will also turn around and claw the tree as a way of marking it. And if you look at these trees up close, you can often find fur snagged in the bark. Um, And that's part of their scent marking rituals. They start to do this in the next couple months as they get into their summer mating season. The marking behaviors will increase. Now, on the West Coast, there's an interesting thing that bears do. On the West Coast, they are known for cambium feeding. So bears will actually strip the outer bark off of a tree and eat the cambium layer, which is the sweet layer underneath that has all the sugars in it. They don't tend to do that in the eastern part of the country or part of the continent, and we don't really know why, but it's just a unique thing to West Coast bears. So bears also make beds, and they often do these day beds when they have a feeding source nearby. In this case, this was a place where there is a grassy field, and in the springtime, the grasses are nice and soft and putting a lot of nutrients into growth. And so there's a lot of energy in that food. And so the bears want to feed on that, and so they stay in that area. And what they'll do is they'll create these beds that they use every night. It's not like a den that they use for months at a time. These could be used for weeks or a month and then abandoned or possibly used the next year. So what they do is they scrape the bark off the tree, and sometimes they'll bite off branches and use whole boughs of a tree, and they'll pile them up and then they'll sleep on those. So you'll get this little depression in the center. They're essentially making themselves a mattress. And here's the little depression in the center where the bear was sleeping. And then you also notice a lot of times these beds eventually become ringed with scat because the bear will wake up and give himself a good stretch and deposit a scat and then go about their day. Because they don't defecate in their bed, they usually do it around where the beds are. So you look around and you will find those scats usually. Um, so the scats in the spring often look like the one in the lower right here. These can be confused with horse scats because the spring scats of bears are commonly made of vegetation. So it could be skunk cabbage leaves, it could be the roots of a plant that's growing, it could be grasses, anything that they're finding and feeding on. And usually this is what their spring scats look like, very green and kind of sweet smelling. It smells a little bit like hay. Bear scats don't really smell badly like carnivore scats do. Carnivore scats tend to have the meat material in them, so they do get that more stinky smell. Bears, when they're feeding on berries, their scats can almost be sweet smelling. This was a unique bear bed right here, where the bear created its little bed on a stump that was in the middle of a ring of redwood trees on the edge of a canyon, and it had a perfect view from up there. It was just the most unique bear bed I'd ever found, so I thought I'd include that one in there. So another animal who has five toes on the front foot and the hind foot, just like the bear, is the striped skunk. And these little cuties also have long claws on their front feet and shorter claws on their hind feet. So the front foot, being this one here, has the longer claws because they use those for digging. They like to dig up things like wasp nests, and they'll dig into the ground. They'll forage for beetle larvae that are in the ground, and they will dig up lawns. And you usually will find these little conical shaped holes that they've dug, and like an upside down volcano. And sometimes there's the remains of the insect that they ate there, and sometimes not. But these long claws on the front feet indicate this is the front foot. The hind foot is this one here, and you don't see much claw action there, but these two front feet on either side of it do show the claws. They look a lot like miniature bear tracks because they do have a wide palm pad, and it looks structurally, it looks very similar to that of the bear. When skunks move, they often lope. So you'll see a front track hind and a front, and then another front, or excuse me, another hind. It's a very common gait for skunks where they'll have this grouping of four tracks, like in a 1-2-1 pattern. So there's a track here, and then there's two tracks close to each other here, and one here. We also call that 3x4 lope. So that's a very common lope gait that the skunks use. So if you find that in snow, often you'll find just the pattern, and then look at the size of the tracks, a little bit over, 3 maybe 3 centimeters or 3.5 centimeters for a little skunk track. And these guys are they don't like to spray. I mean, they're not going to give up that resource if they don't have to. If they are threatened, they might spray, but they don't go around spraying because it does take them a long time to um, regenerate that once they've used it. So they're kind of careful about that. So if we startle them, sometimes they do spray. And I had a cat once that didn't learn his lesson and got skunked twice. Um, there's a remedy for skunk scent. You can use, I believe it's dish soap and hydrogen peroxide and water. There's a formula online that actually works. I used it on my cat when he got skunked. So coyotes, more and more we have urban coyotes around, and coyotes do very well in the urban areas. We have quite a large population in many of our cities, and they get along just fine. They hunt rabbits, they hunt rats, they hunt all small mammals, but they are very adaptable animals and are able to live quite closely with humans. Coyotes, like all canines, have 4 toes on their tracks. And in the coyote track, one thing that helps you tell the coyote track from the domestic dog track is how tight those toes are to each other. So if you see the toes of a coyote, they're very tightly gosh, I don't know why the thing's doing that, but they're very tight in the track. They're not splayed out like those of a dog, which I'll show you in a minute. Um, so coyotes walk mostly in wild areas. They're walking on wilder surfaces. They're not walking on concrete. So their toes are a little bit stronger and not looser like those of a dog that walks on concrete. So they tend to be held tight into the track, not splayed. The toes also point relatively forward rather than splaying out to the side like those of a dog. They tend to point more forward on the coyote tracks. So look for that. And coyote tracks are surprisingly not really that large. Um, and coyotes have very fine pinprick claws. So the claws may not show very readily in the track, but in this case, there's one here and one here. Apologize for the weirdness there. But the claws are here. The outer 2 toes aren't showing the claws in these tracks, but they're fine. They're pinprick size, very hard to see, easy to overlook, and often confused with cat tracks because they apparently don't show claws. But the symmetry of this track will tell you it's a canine track. So canine tracks in general, if you were to split them in half, they would be mirror images of each other. They're symmetrical. Feline tracks will show a leading toe. It's quite a different experience than a canine track, but canine tracks in general are fairly symmetrical. You could kind of group the toes into rows, and then you can slice the track in half, and it's a very symmetrical looking track. So that is more characteristic of the coyote than the dog, because dogs, again, they splay. Um, I included this track over here on the left because it's quite unique in that this toe is shorter than this toe on this coyote. This is a local coyote that I've been tracking for a couple of years now, and its hind toe is unique in that it has one shorter than the other, and so it just looks kind of lopsided, the little track, and that's a way to identify this individual animal. And that happens sometimes. Trackers will find animals that have unique deformities or something different about their foot. Maybe they're missing a toe, or maybe one toe is shorter than the other. That gives you the ability to track an individual animal, which is kind of fun, to be able to know that, hey, this individual's been here for 4 years and I'm still finding his tracks. Coyotes, like all canines, can use many gaits. They tend to move through the landscape, a lot of times loping or trotting. Trotting, it tends to be a very easy to sustain gait for the wild canines where they can just trot for miles at a time. They just get into this rhythm and just keep trotting. So down below this, the gait that is shown there is a gait called a side trot used by canines, where the front tracks land on one side of the trail and the hind tracks land on the other side of the trail. the animal is moving in the direction towards the right this way, but the hind tracks, which are these ones, the hind tracks all landed on the same side of the track. And that's a gait that you can look for in coyotes, wolves, foxes. They'll often use this side trot. And the theory is that they're slightly turning their body to the side as they move to make that pattern. Trots are very efficient gaits, and they're energy conserving, and the animals can use them for long distances. Um, so coyotes in the urban areas obviously will get into things that we may not want them to, like, excuse me, garbage dumpsters, like over here on the left. And you can find their tracks in areas where you would not expect them normally in wild areas. So look for them on the sides of garbage cans, look for them on sidewalks, in backyards, on decks. Coyote scat. So with tracking, scats are often identifiable to species or at least to a genus like the canid genus or the felid genus. So canine scats tend to have a twisty, ropey appearance to them. They're kind of twisted over each other, folded around each other, often have pointed ends, but it may not. These characteristics vary, but look for predator scats often show bone shards and pieces of fur, a lot of fur sometimes in this case. And the coyotes having an omnivorous diet will also show fruit and seeds and vegetative stuff in their scat. So if you find a canine appearing scat that has part fur in it and part seeds, you may have a coyote scat or a little fox. So red fox is another common visitor to urban interface areas, and they have the same type of foot structure as other canines. So they have four toes, very symmetrically arranged, and they have claw marks that often show, but sometimes might be difficult to see. So there is a claw mark right there. It's just really hard to see it. Oops, excuse me. It's right there. Um, so the claw marks might be faint or hard to see in these animals. They also have a lot of fur on their feet. So certain times a year they may have more fur on their feet than others. In the wintertime, that fur helps them to stay on top of the snow and to move around easier in that type of substrate. And so you will find tracks like this one over here where you can just see the fur marks. All those marks in there are from the fur. And because they have so much fur on their feet, a lot of times the pad detail is obscured. So the little toe pads may show just as a little tiny little thing that shows through. There may not be much showing there at all. Like in the illustration here, you might see just a little bit of a pad. Um, and red foxes are known to have a really hard pad, bar shaped, kind of chevron shaped, that you'll see in the heel on the front and the hind, although it's more prominent in the front tracks than the hind tracks, that bar shaped heel. And you can see it over here in this front track and over here in this hind track. So in canines, oops, excuse me, in canine tracks, the front track is often larger than the hind track. You can see here that it's slightly wider. This is the front track here, and this one is the hind track over here. And you can see the width is different. So this one is a little bit less wide than the hind track, and it's slightly longer. So just a little bit bigger. And that's another way that you could tell front from hind tracks on canines as well as felines. The pads are smaller on the hind tracks. You can see it here. And the toes themselves are a little bit smaller as well. So again, this one demonstrates how fine those claw marks can be. They're really small, very faint. I'm going to try and scribble on them here, but they're super hard to see at all. This one has fairly good claw marks. And this one here. Now, the same is true with the coyote, where those outer two toes, this one and this one, the claw marks may be so fine that they're easy to overlook. And that's the opposite of those of dogs, where dogs have more blunt claws and they splay, so they're a lot easier to see. But in foxes, sometimes it's very difficult to see the claw marks. Here's a dog track. Now, dogs, of course, because there are so many different breeds of dogs, their tracks vary widely. The one on the left there is what you would picture as kind of the typical dog track. Symmetrical. You can slice it down the middle, and both halves are very mirror image to each other. And then the toes themselves, if you were to draw lines across them, they're very lined up and just display this extreme symmetry. So this is a track that demonstrates very well those blunt claw marks that I was talking about. Remember on the fox and the coyote how difficult some of those claws were to see. On the dogs, they're pretty prominent. But you can get some extremes in dogs as well. So these ones here on the right have extremely furry feet. Look at the amount of fur imprints that are showing on those tracks there. This was a small dog, and those tracks were the size of a very small fox, but they had a lot of fur on them. So this is a domestic dog breed that was just happened to have super furry feet. So that this illustrates the extreme variation in dog tracks. And part of the AKC standards often dictate the foot type on dogs. So there are dogs that are known as cat-footed dogs because their feet are kind of pudgy and round, and their tracks look very much like those of cats. There are hare-footed dogs which have elongated tracks or elongated feet that look more like those of a rabbit or a hare. So you can check on the breed standards to determine kind of what sort of tracks your dog might be leaving if it's one of those breeds. So again, just like with the other canines, the front track is larger and wider than the hind track. The hind track is much more oval in shape and elongated rather than the front track. And when you find dog scat, usually it's very uniform in color and in texture, and it was made from kibble. So instead of the variation in diet that the wild dogs have, domestic dog scats are going to be pretty uniform and easier to identify to as domestic dogs. So cats, and this is our first cat here, have very round feet. So over here on the left, you have two tracks. You have one on top of the other. So there's one there, and you can see remains of another one right below it. Um, and they're very round overall. Their toes are fairly oval to teardrop shaped and face mostly forward. They don't tend to splay a whole lot unless they're in muddy substrates. Cats usually show three lobes on the trailing edge of the pad. And whoops, sorry about that. So they show three lobes there, and then they show two lobes on the leading edge of the pad. Sometimes the pad looks a little bit just flat rather than bilobed, but that's just because of the way they hit the substrate. Their feet, if you have a domestic cat, you can, if they're cooperative, you can look at their little feet, and you'll see that this leading edge does have two lobes. I don't know why my mouse keeps making those little extra points there, but anyway. And so look for those. The hind track on the house cat is also, again, a little bit more oval in shape and elongated than the front track. Front track tends to be a little bit more roundish and a little bit wider, a little bit more pudgy looking. So on domestic cats, they do have claws. They have really sharp claws. And if you have a cat, you've probably been scratched. But their claws are retractable or protractable. So when they walk, their claws are held up off the ground. And that's why they say stay so sharp, is because they're not using them for traction when they're they're out and about in the woods, they are using those claws just for hunting. And so in the wild, those cats tend to be stealth hunters. They tend to sneak up closely to their prey, so they have these wide paths that allow them to walk quietly. And so they're more of a pounce and hunt type of a predator, or they'll lie in wait and stalk close to their prey and make brief bursts of speed to catch their prey. Whereas dogs, like your coyotes and your wolves, they tend to chase the prey, and they're an animal that is adapted to chase that prey over long distances, and so they're built for that, and they have the claws that they use for digging in for traction. So the structure of their feet kind of indicates their hunting strategy among the wild animals, and then our domestic cats are just more tame versions of the wild cats like the bobcats, lynx, and mountain lion. So here we have the cottontail, and cottontails are another common urban animal. Their tracks are kind of interesting in that they also have a lot of fur on their feet. So I don't we can't see the feet in the image of that cottontail, but cottontails and snowshoe hares and other lagomorphs, which are your rabbits and hares, they have four toes on their hind feet. So these are the hind feet here. The longer, more paddle-shaped hind feet are paired, and they land ahead of the front feet. So when this animal is moving, it's using a gait called a bound. So what it does is it pushes off with the hind feet, and the front feet launch airborne, and then it hits the ground with the front feet first. Then the hind feet come around and land ahead of those front feet, and the animal's body is bunched up, ready to leap off into the next leap. So that's how they're moving, and that's why you have the front tracks first, and then the hind tracks paired um, behind them. The direction of travel for this animal is toward the top. And for this animal, it's that way. So that's the way that they move. They usually use the bounding gait. And so this is typical of most lagomorphs. And squirrels use this also, but squirrels' tracks look a little different, which we'll see in a minute. Um, because there's so much fur on the feet of rabbits, it can be difficult to make out the toes. In the drawing, you can see them, but in the actual tracks, you can see the toes themselves. You can see where the toes are, but finding a little pad in that toe is very difficult. Um, so that's because of the obscuring of the toes due to the fur in the feet. And again, the same thing with these hind tracks. You can see that there are four toes here, but there's very little pad detail. It's fairly smooth and uniform because there are those toes are covered with fur. They do have claws, and they don't usually show up unless you're in good substrate. And oftentimes, this happens with the hind feet when they push off, because that's where their propulsion comes from. They push off with those paired hind feet, and those hind feet dig into the substrate and they leave claw marks. The front tracks do have a fifth toe, but oftentimes it only shows up as a tiny little pinprick of a claw. It's fairly rare to actually see the toe showing up on that fifth toe. So they have five and four, five on the front and four on the hind, and they're very asymmetrical. Um, Even the hind tracks are fairly asymmetrical because there's a leading toe. So this toe is further ahead than that toe on their hind tracks. So look for the asymmetry, look for that gait in particular, and that will help you tell rabbit from squirrel, which is the two that could be confused really are rabbit and squirrel. Sometimes on the hares, the larger hares, those hind tracks can look very canine because of the four toes and because they're fairly symmetrical, but they're also asymmetrical. So when you find their hind tracks, especially the larger ones like the snowshoe hares and the jackrabbits, sometimes those hind tracks can be easily confused with canine. So rabbit scats, because they are herbivores, their scats are going to look like round as opposed to the oval or pill-shaped structure of the deer scats. Rabbits are spherical or round. They're kind of flattened spears, and they're made out of sawdust pretty much because rabbits will be eating a lot of browse, which is the woody material in the wintertime. They will eat greenery, but that's in the other seasons of the year when there's snow on the ground. Pretty much that's what they can get to. Sometimes they'll dig down to it. If they have to, they can dig to get to material that's hidden under snow. So if a rabbit is leaving a lot of scats in an area, it is because it's been hanging out there a long time. So rabbits excrete one pellet at a time. Whereas deer, when they excrete pellets, they'll excrete a whole bunch of them, like, 3 or 4 dozen at a time. Rabbits, it's a single pellet at a time. There was one study done on the black-tailed jackrabbit where they counted and they determined that it did 544 scats per day. So single pellets. So if there's an accumulation like over here on the right, that means the rabbits have been hanging out there, and that's usually where there's a food source. Um, that's why you'll find larger accumulations of their scats. The red squirrel. These guys are cute. So little red squirrels are related to the West Coast Douglas squirrel. And these guys are one of the more common little and very vocal little squirrels in our forests. Um, their tracks, like those of all rodents, show 4 toes on their front feet and 5 on the hind feet. Again, they're using that gait just like the rabbits were. They're using the bounding gait where the front tracks land and then the hind tracks come around and land ahead of the front tracks. Direction of travel is toward the top here. So if you look closely at the structure of these front feet, you'll see that there are 4 pads in here. And the mouse is doing that weird thing, but there are 4 pads, and they have 2 little proximal pads, or the pads that are further back on the wrist, which is equivalent to on our hand, that pad on our hand. Um, there is a tiny 5th toe, the thumb, on the front track of rodents, but it usually doesn't show up. In the red squirrel, it shows up probably a little bit better than it does in gray squirrels, but it's very tiny, easy to overlook, and just often not seen in the tracks. So they have long toes. The 3 central toes on the hind track are grouped together. So there's 1, 2, and 3 here. And then the 2 outer toes of the hind track face outward. The front track also, the toes face outward, the outer 2 pointing mostly to the sides, and the leading 2 pointing mostly forward, usually. They don't tend to splay a whole lot. They can, but they don't really tend to show up splayed like to the extreme degree like dog and cat tracks splay out. So look for those 4 pads on the front track, excuse me, 3 pads on the front track. And the central pad on the front track itself is shared by these central toes. This pad goes with that toe, and this pad goes with that toe. So there's kind of your typical front squirrel track structure. The hind track, again, four pads on the hind track, and roughly in that orientation. And then you'll have the 3 central toes, which point forward, and you'll have the outer toes pointing to the side. So that's your typical squirrel hind track structure. They're fairly small. In this one, side-by-side comparison, which was an excellent comparison here, you have the red squirrel over here, and then, or excuse me, you have the chipmunk over here. This is Mr. Chipmunk, and this is a red squirrel. So the squirrel's slightly bigger than a chipmunk, not a drastic difference like it would be between a chipmunk and a gray squirrel, but they're very similar in structure. So the chipmunk also has a very similar foot to the red squirrel, although the red squirrel toes tend to be a little bit longer and thinner than those of the chipmunk. Notice how short the toes are on that chipmunk there. The same is true on the hind track. So this is an excellent side-by-side comparison. to show you the size of these two common squirrel species. Um, Red squirrels make middens, so this is a common sign to look for. They take their food, so they'll grab a cone and they'll take it to a favorite feeding perch, and they'll use that same perch over and over repeatedly until it develops a huge accumulation, which we call a midden. And that's a characteristic of the red squirrel. Gray squirrels tend to be more dispersed. They'll feed on a cone wherever they find it rather than bringing it back to a perch. And the red squirrels also store a lot of food in larders, and so they will harvest cones, take them back to a burrow or a hollow in a tree and store them there. And then when they feed on them, they'll bring them from that little larder to a nearby log or perch that they like, and they'll feed on them there. So they develop these middens, and some of these middens found in Alaska and places like that are cover acres. They're huge. They're just generational accumulations of midden material. And at that point, the midden becomes a storage location because the squirrel can dig a burrow into the discarded cone scales and store more cones in there. And the moisture will prevent those cones from germinating into trees. And so that gives them the ability to store that food for a longer time. They also do this thing where they mark on trees. So they'll bite a tree and you'll find paired marks like this. This is a really subtle sign, but it is kind of a territorial marking thing. And red squirrels are fairly territorial and will chase others out of their territory. But look for those bite marks in trees where they're marking their territory. And I really like the red squirrel and the Douglas squirrel because they do this fun thing here where remember they make middens, right? They store their cones. Well, they also store mushrooms. And so during mushroom season, you might find little mushrooms hanging up in trees. And that's because the red squirrel has grabbed that mushroom and taken it up there and placed it in the branches of a tree where it's safe from others. And the mushroom will dry, and then it'll take it and store it in its larder for later use. So they're known for this, and it's quite cute to find the mushrooms decorating the trees all throughout the forest wherever a squirrel has been active. So this is a behavior that's pretty unique to them. Gray squirrels will also take mushrooms, but they tend to take them to a perch and feed on them right away rather than storing it and allowing it to dry. Chipmunks, this is the one that we saw the comparison just a moment ago. Chipmunks are small, tiny little squirrels, and their tracks also show the same type of structure that we find in most of the squirrel tracks, where there are four pads. So you can see the little pads here on the hind track, and then you can see the toe marks. The three central toes are grouped together, and then the two outer toes pointing to the sides. That's the typical form of a rodent hind track in the squirrel family. And the front tracks, you can see the four toes again here, and then those three pads down here. Whoops. Um, and that's your typical structure of the chipmunk's hind track. And notice how much smaller they are than those of the red squirrel. And they're drastically smaller than those of gray and fox squirrels. So this probably the smallest squirrel track that you will find is that of the chipmunk. They again use that same gait like the other ones we're using, the bound where the front tracks land, and then the hind tracks come around those front tracks, landing ahead of them, and then the hind tracks are prepared to provide the propulsion into the next leap. And so their body is bunched up, and then they leap and they're airborne for a moment, and then they hit the ground with the front tracks. The hind tracks come around, land ahead of them, and then they do it again. So that's their movement strategy, and a lot of the squirrels and smaller rodents will use that. Other animals like rats will use the walking gaits, but you can see again pretty clearly down here in these tracks. This is the squirrel type structure of four pads And I have no idea why it makes those little points there, but um, the four pads, and then we call this the 1-3-1 grouping. So excuse me, 1-3-1. So that one should be over here. 1-3-1. So there's one toe here. The three central toes are grouped together, and then there's another toe over there. And that's typical of most rodents, particularly the squirrels. Voles are another very small rodent. They're also called meadow mice. They're in the genus Microtus, most of them. And these guys have short tails. They look like mice with short ears and short tails. These are your voles. And voles tend to make these really cool trails through the grasses. So a lot of times, if you have a piece of plywood or something that's been laying on the ground for a while, and you pick that up and look under it, you'll see these little tunnels underneath. And those are the tunnels of a vole. And what they do is they're feeding in the grasses, and especially in taller grasses, those tunnels help them to hide from predators. If we mow the field or if we expose it by picking up the plywood, then the tunnels are exposed. Normally, these tunnels are hidden, and you can see in the picture on the left, this field was mowed, and that exposed the little vole tunnels. Um, and normally, they run around underneath in these tunnels under the tall grass, and it provides them cover so a hawk or an owl can't see them in the little tunnel um, as they're moving around. So they will eat the vegetation around the entrance to these tunnels, or excuse me, this is the burrow, but you can see how the vegetation around the entrances has been cut short. It's been consumed, and you can see all the vegetation here has been eaten by the vole. So they're keeping that short because they don't want to go out in the open where they're exposed to feed when they can just pop out of the burrow, grab some food, and go back down and eat it. So this is their strategy for survival and not being eaten. Because voles are a very small and abundant mammal, they are prey for a lot of animals. You'll find vole bones in owl pellets a lot of times, and many mammals eat them. Foxes, coyotes, everybody eats the voles. So they develop their strategies to survive and try not to be eaten because that's their goal. Um, if you look closely in their little tunnels, this is what a tunnel looks like when it has not been exposed. So you can see how the grasses are over it, they're covering it. If you look down inside, you can see the little scats. And those scat accumulations tell you that this is an active tunnel. When you look at those scats, they look like a little grain of rice, as opposed to mouse scats, which are, well, mouse scats are about the same, but vole scats look different from bat scats, which I'm going to show you in a moment. So here's a tunnel. The tunnel is only 2 centimeters wide. Here's the little tunnel. You can see how it's been maintained by the grasses within it are clipped short, and they do that by eating them, of course. And then they try not to go over exposed areas if they can. They try to make their little tunnels just under the more covered grassy areas where they are not seen. They're very exposed if they're running across this open area. So they tend to scurry across that really quickly and not spend much time there. Okay, bats are another animal that are frequently found near humans. And the main sign of bats, we're not going to see their tracks usually because they don't spend a lot of time on the ground. They will come to the ground sometimes, but it's a rare occasion. Usually, what you'll find is an accumulation of scats underneath a particular perch. Many bats live in large groups, colonial groups, and you'll find large accumulations of scats underneath their or their day roosts, excuse me. Um, and so look for scats of bats are going to look a little bit rougher than those of the vole. They're still kind of pellet shaped, but they vary a little bit. They're a little rougher on the outside. They're not as perfectly shaped like a grain of rice. And they break up easily because they're usually made up of parts of insects. So carapaces of the bugs that they've eaten during the night. And so you'll find large accumulations under their roosts. They usually roost during the day, and under bridges is a common place to look for them. Um, Against houses, a lot of times where the gutter joins the roof. There might be a little crack, and all they need is a small crack to get into, and they climb up inside. Corrugated roofs are a good one for them to hide in because the corrugated roofs have little openings that bats can go in. So look for them up against buildings, under bridges, places like that, and you'll find the scat accumulations. Sometimes the scat accumulations are not as dense as this because the groups will be smaller. You might have a dozen bats and you'll only have very few scattered scats below, but that tells you that you have bats. Bats are beneficial, and we don't want to exclude them if we can avoid it because they do eat insects, especially mosquitoes and things that bite humans. Rats. So we have brown rat and we have the roof rat. And these little guys live, of course, in the urban interface. Are everywhere where humans are and pretty much worldwide. And rats have a slightly different structure than the other rodents in that they have six pads on their hind track. So what you're looking at over here is the hind track. And you can see that there's pads here. There are six pads on this guy, which matches this illustration over here. There are six pads on the hind foot, as opposed to the hind foot of the squirrel, which had four. Excuse me. And also on rats, the outer toes tend to be more splayed out to the sides. They point farther out to the sides, closer to a 90-degree angle to the direction of travel than those of your squirrels. And again, like most rodents, they have these three toes in the front that are grouped together and point forward. And we call that the 1-3-1 relationship. So one toe pointing outwards, three toes pointing forward, and one toe pointing to the side. So 1-3-1 toes on the hind feet of rodents. That'll help you remember it. Um, Rats leave scats wherever they go, and if you have rats, you know it because they leave these large pellet-shaped scats. Sometimes these are made out of whatever material they're getting into. So they could be getting into pet food, could be getting into garbage. But these scats are a lot larger than those of the voles and the mice and the squirrels that I just showed you. Rat tracks on the front foot also have four toes, just like other rodents. There is a little bit more of an angle pointing to the side on the front toes of the rats um, than in the squirrels. So look for now on this in this one over here, if you draw a line like that, it's almost perpendicular. So the direction of travel is forward here, that direction, and it's almost perpendicular to the line of travel, that a line drawn through those outer toes. And again, it's got that typical 1-3-1 relationship that tells you it's a rodent track. And if you find tracks with extreme splay on those outer toes and around, I think that's millimeter. I'm sorry. I'm not sure about that ruler, but these would be your rat tracks. So look for those because they are very common in urban areas, and just look for this very extreme angle of the outer two toes to be pointing almost out to the side to help indicate that that's a rat track. All right. So I'm going to talk about a couple of birds because obviously in the urban interface, we have birds that come into our yard all the time. And mourning doves are one of the more common birds that we can see, and their tracks are pretty unique. Dove tracks in general, they look like kind of strings of alternating feet because they don't take long steps. They take really short steps. And so there's the left foot and the right foot, and they just look like they string together as they're going. They have, if you look closely at them, you can see kind of the bumpy texture in there. If you have really good substrate, you can see the bumpy texture on their feet, the little musculature that shows up on the bottom of the feet. And what's really cool about dove tracks, and this is true for your feral pigeons, mourning doves, and Eurasian collared doves, there's a curvature to the track. So notice how these two toes curve. If you were to draw a line, those two central toes make a big curve. And so that's pretty typical of dove tracks, as is the short stride and this bumpy texture. Sometimes, if you're in really good substrate, you'll see a little tiny dot right in the middle where the tarsal pad from the foot shows up. But that you have to have very fine substrate to see that. Um, so these are your mourning dove tracks. And mourning doves, another sign that you have mourning doves is, of course, their scats. Dove scats are kind of unique. Trackers call them a cinnamon bun form because they have this coiled appearance. They're round, they're just a little coil with a white frosting on top, and that's the uric material that's on top, the white stuff. Bird scats in general tend to have that white stuff, but dove scats are the ones that have this coiled form and with the white topping on them, just like cinnamon buns. So if you see cinnamon bun scat in a large accumulation, that means you have doves of one species or another. Mourning dove feathers I like because they kind of have this M-shaped uh, pattern to the tail feathers, which tells me mourning dove. So just if you find feathers, because where birds are, they're going to be shedding feathers, and so you may find a mourning dove feather and be able to identify it. There's a really great website from US FWS, Fish and Wildlife Service, that has feathers from many common birds found on this continent, and I rely on that to identify feathers. So I've included that here a couple of times just so you can see they show all the feathers, they show the colors and patterns and sizes so that you can identify them when you find them. Blue jays, being another commonly found bird, have these really cool tracks. So jays, crows, ravens, the corvids in general have a track structure where they have three toes. I'm going to draw kind of a standard one here. One, two, three toes pointing forward and one toe pointing backwards. That's kind of the structure of your typical bird track. So on the corvids, when you have this, the two outer toes and the one pointing backwards, this toe tends to be closer to that inner toe. So if this was the left foot, this toe here and this toe here are closer together than towards that outer toe. So that's typical of all your corvids. So that would be jays, crows, ravens, magpies. So on the blue jay, the same thing is true, although the toes are held very closely together. So they do have three toes pointing forward and one toe pointing backwards, but these two toes are closer together than this outer toe is to the middle one on most corvids. So jays look for a very narrow track with toes kind of crammed together. They don't do a lot of splaying outward. They tend to be crammed together. So these are jay tracks. And this is typical of blue jay, Steller's jay, scrub jay. The jays usually have very thin and narrow leading toes because they're held together. Turkeys are another common bird that is found around humans. Turkeys have three toes that point forward, and the inner toe, this is the left foot, the inner toe is shorter than this outer toe here. You often have this round circular tarsal pad, and you also show the toe that faces backwards often shows as just a claw mark. So over here on these ones in the trail, you can see the toe facing backwards, which we call the halix. Is it faces backwards, and then three toes pointing forward with that little bitty tarsal pad. And this is typical of turkeys and pheasants and quail, this type of structure. And look for the inner toe. So this is a left foot here. That did not come out very well. Let's do the right foot here. This is the right foot. This is the inner toe. And it's a lot shorter than this outer toe here. Yep, the mouse is not cooperating today. But when turkeys walk, they tend to walk with one foot in front of the other. They will run and you'll have a longer stride. Okay, so turkeys, and let's go to the next one. Pileated woodpeckers tend to make large rectangular shaped holes in trees, and are easy to recognize because they're the one that makes the largest holes. Of all the woodpeckers, they have a really tough beak and are able to put quite large holes in trees. And our last one here is the sapsucker. Sapsuckers make these wells in trees, and the holes that they make go into the cambium layer where the sap is flowing, and that sweet sap has sugars in it that they feed on. So they maintain these wells open so that the sap continues to flow and they can feed on it. And by doing that, they also help hummingbirds, which come through early before the flowers have bloomed and have no other sources of sap. So they take advantage of the sapsucker wells to feed. All right, so if you need help with track identification, I hope you've enjoyed the brief look that I've given you. If you need any help, there's a project on iNaturalist called the North American Animal Tracks Database, where you can post tracks and get trackers to help you. Also, the Animals Don't Cover Their Tracks Facebook group, where we help identify tracks. People can submit them from anywhere in the world to that group, and we will help you. And then resources that I've got a YouTube channel called Bear Tracker 777, and look for Bear Tracker nature films. And then Bear Tracker's Animal Tracks Den at bear-tracker.com is my website all about tracks and signs. And you can always email me tracks from there and I will help you identify them. And that's all I've got. Thank you very much for being here. And I have time for questions now.
Okay, back to here. I see a couple questions have come in and a couple of comments. One comment said, I'd like to obtain the ruler with the print pictures I saw on many slides. Kim, you're on top of it.
I put that up there. You can get them from me. If you can also go to my website, and there's a graphic there that tells you, I accept PayPal and stuff for those, and you get them directly from me. And there you go. Shipping to Canada, I would just add an extra $1 for shipping because it does cost more to ship to Canada. But they're there. There's a graphic that I uploaded if everybody would like to find that.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.
A couple questions in the Q&A. One asked, when you talk about a 3x4 lope or a 2x2 walk, what do the numbers stand for?
Okay, so 3x4 lope stands for the arrangement of the feet. So they have 4 feet and they're grouped in 3 groups. So there's one foot, and then there's a hind, and then a front and a hind, and then there's another front. So that 1, 2, 3 groupings of 4 feet is a 3x4 lope. It's also called a 1-2-1 lope because the grouping is 1 foot, 2 feet, 1 feet. And a 2x2 walk is where the 2 feet in a walk land close to each other. So the raccoons is a 2x2, so 2 feet space, 2 feet, etc. That's a repeating 2x2 walk.
Okay.
Yeah.
The second question in the Q&A asks, any information or idea of skunks, especially the holes made in grass? And I'd like to add my own to that because you said skunks dig up wasp nests, and that just seems like a bad idea.
It does seem like a bad idea. They dig them up, bears dig them up, raccoons dig them up. They're after the larvae because the larvae are just little packages of protein that they want to eat. And like bears, they just ignore the stings. And skunks, I don't know how they get away with it, but they do. They must dig really fast. They dig up those subterranean wasp nests and drag away the structure with the larva inside the cells. They just drag that away and feed on it, assuming the wasps don't chase them, but I don't know how they deal with it.
And is there any way to tell a hole dug by a skunk apart from other animals? I think that's the core of this
Usually,
question.
yeah, usually the skunks, they're more conical in shape, so they're kind of wide at the top and narrow towards the bottom, so they're kind of conical in shape, like a little upside down volcano. And they can be small, but I've seen skunks that were after prey dig a hole, that deep that were put their whole body down in the hole trying to get to a cricket that it was going to eat. But it just depends. Mostly they're after little grubs and larvae that are in the lawn in the moist upper few centimeters of the soil, and so they're not very deep because they're just going after those larvae. Um, Sometimes they get really dedicated to digging, but a lot of times it's just like a whole bunch of little holes, upside down
Yes,
conical
that's what I
holes.
think I've seen in our lawn.
Yeah.
There's a new question. Is it just because white-tailed bucks are bigger and heavier that we see their dew claws? I always thought only buck tracks showed dew claws.
No, that's actually a legend. The dew claws can show on the does, the fawns, and the bucks. It's really a matter of how fast they're moving. So how fast that or how heavy that hoof is striking the ground, it can cause it to splay out. And when it splays out, a lot of times the dew claws will show. If they're in deeper substrate, the dew claws will show because as they're walking, the hoof is here, but the dew claws are up on the wrist. And so if they hit the ground hard, that part can hit the ground as well. So it will show. Usually with bucks and does, there's a difference in the width of the front track and the length of the front track, so that when you have those overlapping front track with a hind track on top of it, you can compare the size of them, and that'll tell you buck versus doe more reliably than whether or not you have the dew claws present.
Oh, thank you for that answer. There was a new one in the chat. How do I deter foxes and raccoons and squirrels from getting into my compost bin? I have a wooden board with flagstones on top of it on the lid itself, but they can pull that off. Is there anything I can add to the fresh compost to neutralize the smell?
I was told to add ammonia to try and deter them, but that doesn't really neutralize the smell. I don't think that might make it more stronger. Um, I'm not really sure what would keep them from getting into compost other than just securing it really well. Because they can smell it no matter what. They're especially, bears, and they have really good sense of smell. They're going to be able to detect that compost.
Yes, I've been there, been trying to keep
Yeah.
raccoons out of the compost, and it
Yeah.
became,
They,
I'm trying to keep you out. Can't you just respect
yeah.
this? But no.
It's hard to do. They want to get at it.
Anthony's commented, Anthony is a beekeeper, and skunks are always a treat to hives. They
Correct.
scratch at the entrance at night, wait for bees to come out, and then eat them. We raise the hives off the ground, which exposes their less protected underside where they get stung.
Wow, that's smart. Okay.
Interesting. Thank you, Anthony, for sharing that.
That's good. I like that. Good technique.
If there are any more questions, feel free to send them in. I have one more of my own. We have been noticing some rabbit browse happening in our area, and it does seem to target the new young trees that aren't very common, the ones that we've planted to add a bit more diversity. Do you know anything about the preferences of the kinds of trees rabbits go for?
Yeah, I'm not sure. In the wintertime, they just tend to eat the lower portion of the trees and shrubs that they can access. I'm not sure about their preferences, if they have particular species that they like better than others, or how to deter them from that other than covering the lower section of the tree with something that they can't bite through. Yeah, if you wanted to protect the trees, maybe foil, something that they can't chew through to.
Yeah. On the other hand, they have a right to eat, especially in
They do.
winter.
Yeah.
Cindy has asked, I have moose at my cottage property. How do their tracks differ from deer? Just larger?
Yeah, they're larger. They're quite a bit larger, and tend to be a little bit longer, but beefier looking. But yeah, they're very similar in structure. They're the two parted hoof with two cleaves, so very similar to deer, just quite a bit larger.
One more comment from Anthony letting us know that wood ashes neutralize compost smells.
Nice. That's cool.
That is cool.
Awesome.
I'll give a few more seconds, but I think we've satisfied a lot of curiosity. Thank you
Cool.
so much, Kim.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for coming. And go find some tracks.